My guest today is best-selling author, screenwriter, and commentator Andrew Klavan. You know his voice from the Andrew Klavan Show on Daily Wire and his pen from his many hit novels and films. His latest book, The Kingdom of Cain, Finding God in the Literature of Darkness, is a deep and compelling meditation on how evil, suffering, and even horror in art and life can open our eyes to the reality of God. Andrew, it's a real pleasure to have you here once again. Welcome back to the
It's
show.
good to see you again, Shaun. Thanks a lot.
Well, let's jump right on into the interview. You described this book as a search for God in the literature of darkness. What does that mean exactly? And why does it matter specifically in today's culture?
Well, to answer your second question first, I think one of the things about Christian art today is it's become kind of pablum-like. It tells us good things, only happy things, and I have nothing against happy movies and happy stories and family movies and family stories. But my concern is that at its peak, Christian art was the greatest art ever made. I mean, if you include writers like Shakespeare, painters like Michelangelo, musicians, composers like Bach, you're listening to the greatest music ever made, and it's full of grief, it's full of horror, it's full of real life. And that means that these were Christians who understood that they had to keep their faith in a world that can be very dark, that not only can be, but is perennially very dark and really is enemy territory, as C.S. Lewis said. And so I'm concerned that when Christians look at that, it's like a woman looking at a romantic comedy and thinking that that's what love is going to be like. Then when you find real love, it's disappointing. It doesn't live up to the movies. And I'm afraid that Christians are going to be the same way when they actually start to realize, and this I think happens in every Christian's life, when they start to realize that the world is not running on the same program as Christ's program, and it can be incredibly dark, even in their own hearts, they lose their faith. And I think that the arts are the ways in which we practice for life. I think that there are experiences that we can have without actually hurting ourselves or hurting anybody else, where we can plumb the depths of what human beings do. And so this is not a book about, oh, look, here's a murder. Oh, this is terrible. Oh, isn't this ugly? And yet we should look at that. It's about famous murders that really capture the imagination of artists and murders that appear again and again in books from Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky to the movies like Psycho by Alfred Hitchcock, and how the artists transform this evil into something that illuminates the world and our relationship with God. And I think that in some ways it's a personal thing because I'm a writer who writes about murder. I write about crime, and I'm frequently getting letters from people who say, you call yourself a Christian and yet all your characters are evil and they do horrible things. It's an answer to why I do that, but it's also an answer to the question, how do we live in light in a dark world? How do we rejoice evermore, not in heaven when everything's great, but right now, which is what the Gospels tell us to do, what the Bible tells us to do is rejoice evermore right now. And so artists are very good at taking ugly things and making them into beautiful things. And if the example I love to use is Macbeth by William Shakespeare, a play of darkness, a play of murder, a play of betrayal and war and death. And it's beautiful. It's a beautiful play. And so that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking what is that beauty? And I believe that beauty is the expression of human life in a dark place in the light of God. That's what I think it is. And I think it can lead us to that light.
Well, I want to pull a little bit more on this thread because as a guy who's worked in Christian publishing for 11 years and very familiar with the Christian media space, especially movies, a lot of folks say we should just make content that focuses on light and very clean, kind of, I don't know if airy fairy is the right word, but those sorts of stories where, like I remember when I worked at Bethany House back in the day, if we described horse poop improperly in a Jeanette Oak novel, we would get letters saying, how dare we, lead people astray
Unbelievable.
by, using crap or something like that in that context. But in terms of, whether it's art, media, whatever we're producing, is there a spiritual value in confronting darkness? Like I think of, horror films I've seen, things that focus on exorcism and the demonic. People are presenting worldview ideas and some like extreme theological ideas in those sorts of circumstances. Yet a lot of people are afraid, like we don't want to partner with darkness. Like, is there a spiritual value in confronting darkness in art?
Well, there must be because the Bible is full of it. I mean, the Bible is full of murder, incest, rape, all the crimes, and it's kind of funny when Christians complain that those things appear in the arts as well. I don't see how they could not if that's what life is composed of. But to put it personally, look, I was 19 years old. I was about as far as from faith as any person could ever get. And not only that, I was in university and professors were telling me there is no morality. Morality is relative. You say this is bad. I say this is bad. There's no way to tell anything from anything else. And that's when I read Fyodor Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, one of the greatest and also darkest novels ever written, a novel about a murderer, an axe murderer who goes in and kills two women, one of them a retarded woman who doesn't even understand what's happening. I read that scene and I just thought, no, wait a minute. There is no planet where that's right. There's no planet anywhere where that is right. And anybody telling me that morality is relative, that it changes depending on where you are and what country you're in, what age you're in, is lying. And even though it took decades from that moment, that was the moment the ship of my life turned around in the direction of God and of Christ. So, and I always think like, well, in the end of the book, one of the people who helps reclaim this murderer's soul is a prostitute. And I always think if I went into a Christian bookstore today and said, have you got the novel about the axe murderer and the prostitute? They'd hurl me out into the street. And yet that's what life is composed of. I've never met a saint. I've never met, oh, I won't say that. I may have met a couple of saints, but mostly I meet people who are nice but corrupt, nice but in moments of difficulty, they might turn corrupt. I meet people who live the lives that we all know they live. And that's what drama is made of. And that is what the world is made of. And if our faith does not apply to that world, if it only applies to the world to come, I don't think it's actually a deep enough faith to survive until we get to the world to come. Because I think when you confront the world as it is, it simply is going to disintegrate. And I want to say this book is about these things. It's not about bathing you in murder. It's not about like saying, oh, here's something really ugly. It's just about that transformation from the destructive to the creative, which I think is something that all of our lives should be about, not just the lives of artists.
Yeah, I don't think I want to be in that cover committee meeting trying to figure out how to do the cover for the book about the axe murder and the prostitute in a Christian genre. Let's
Yeah.
let's avoid that one. One of the most powerful ideas I think from this book is that the idea that like art, dark, tragic art, can lead us into spiritual insight. Like, why do you think stories filled with violence or despair can give us a clearer or maybe a more direct mirror into the soul? Maybe in a way that just art that's only light. Like it's a different perspective.
Yeah, because I think you never see pure goodness in the world. I mean, that's the thing about the world. It's a fallen world, and you see people who are good people and people do good things, but you never see the purity of goodness that we believe that people who, for instance, looked into the face of Christ might have seen. But you do see pure evil. And the fact about pure evil is that it actually takes you out of the world of the flesh into the world of the spirit. When you finally see, oh, there is something that cannot be defined in any way but in terms of spiritual evil, then you have something to work with. Then you have a way to get out of your cynicism, that cynicism that says, everything is relative, or the cynicism that says, well, nobody is really good inside. They're always just hiding that so that they feel good about themselves or so that they virtue signal to other people. That's actually not true. There are people who are evil, and there are people who are at least moving in the trajectory of the good. And so people are fascinated by murder because it reveals something, not just about people, but it reveals something about the moral order that can't be denied. And even when you talk to people who don't believe in God and therefore can't believe in good and evil, they can't logically believe in it, they know it when they see it. And I think that is why these things are so gripping to people of all kinds, even perfectly nice people who would never commit a murder or even think about committing a murder, want to see that in the arts because it actually centers them in the moral world. And that, I think, is actually a beautiful thing, even though in real life murder is nothing but ugliness.
Well, and, pulling a little bit more again on that thread, more from the angle of suffering. Do you believe that great art requires the presence of suffering, or can joy and beauty speak to, say, the divine with equal strength, or does darkness simply hit deeper, maybe coming at it from a suffering lens?
I think that in storytelling, there are different kinds of art. And I think there is music sometimes that communicates pure joy. But I can't think of a story that doesn't take people into dark places. And the problem for me with a lot of Christian art is that you never really get to those dark places. I mean, it's always like a prayer, is we're all going to get together and pray and everything's going to be fine. And when I realized that I was becoming a Christian, I mean, like I said, I'm a crime writer. One of the first things I said to God, I was sitting there going, oh my gosh, what's happening to me? And I said to him, God, whatever happens, don't let me become a Christian novelist. You know, please, please, whatever happens to me, don't, because I just think that doesn't actually tell anybody anything. I get it. It's relaxing. I have nothing against it. I don't think it should be illegal. I don't think people should not read it or go to those movies. But I think that to get a deeper view of life, you need a deeper view of life. You need a art with a deeper view of life. And that's why, I think Shakespeare is one of the greatest Christian writers who ever lived, probably the greatest Christian writer ever lived. And his stories can be incredibly dark. Dostoevsky was openly a Christian and, was actually a believing Christian who got his faith in the darkest of circumstances. Every one of his great novels is about a murder. And so I think that there is something there that enriches our lives in a way that we can apply to reality instead of taking us away. There's nothing wrong with comfort art, but if that's the only art you ever look at, you're going to find when you meet discomfort, you might be unprepared. And so that's the argument of this book, that we actually can find beauty in arts that are dark, and therefore learn to find beauty in a world that can be very dark.
And Andrew, you and I talked maybe 2 years ago, I think, about your biography, the Great Good Thing, and you share in that book, obviously, about seasons of pain, doubt, like it's your life story. I'd love to hear just a bit from you, having read multiples of your novels as well. Like when, for in our own journeys with our personal traumas and pain, like how can we show God or display our journey, maybe in our creative process or writing, pulling from that? Because again, the more I've learned about your life, the more I see threads in your different stories. We're like, oh, that's from Andrew's life, that's from Andrew's life, but
Yeah.
Andrew's life. But in terms of maybe how we express God in those journeys, how can we pull in our own pain and suffering?
Well, that's interesting. The second half of this book is about. I mean, my argument in this book is that evil is defined as being the absence of love, and the purpose of love is creation. And all of us, when we live rightly, I think, live a creative life, not just artists. Artists are kind of like baseball. You watch a baseball player to learn how to be excellent. Not all of us can be professional baseball players, but you watch a baseball player to learn how to be excellent, how to take what talents you have and move them to the highest level. I think you go to art, great art, true art, to see how you can take this world as it is and make it creative. And so the second half of this book is about the things that I do that keep my mind creative, and therefore trained on the Creator, because I believe that creativity in life is continuing the work of God. And so, I think that each murder that I look at basically these three famous murders. One of them, the first murder, the murder of Abel by Cain, and each one of those has an answer. It presents an idea of how we separate ourselves from God. And I talk about the things that I do in my life, things like appreciating the beauty of art and appreciating the beauty of life through art. Things like rituals that imbue in my body the holiness of everything. So, like, I'm communion is at the center of my worship because it teaches you that even bread and wine are the body and blood of God, and so you start to realize that every moment is infused with God. And then therapy, because as you said, in my young life, I was terribly, terribly troubled to the point of being suicidal, and I found a wonderful therapist. And over the years, at the time, I thought, well, what's curing me here is the therapy, because he's got this theory and he's read Freud and I've read Freud and we're figuring out my psychology. And later on, I realized, oh, that had nothing to do with it. What was happened was I got into a loving mentor relationship with this man, and he became my mentor. And the love that I felt for him is what healed me. And I recently, not that long ago, I said to Jordan Peterson, you guys, you psychologists, you all think you've got some theory, but really it's all about the love between you and the person you treat. And Jordan, in that inimitable voice, well, it's not inimitable. Everybody imitates it except for me. But he said, oh, every good therapist knows that. And I said, well, you must know a lot more good therapists than I know, because most therapists I know think they have a theory. So these are practices, the practice of a loving mentor relationship, the practice of appreciating the arts and how the arts turn darkness to light, the process of ritual, religious ritual, and other kinds of ritual that teach your flesh to treat the world as holy. Those are the answers to murder and the answers to darkness. And I think that those are the things that artists do when they take dark subjects and transform them into great works of art.
Well, I think in terms of the story of Cain and Abel, that's one of many parts of the Bible where we're so overly familiar with the story, we kind of miss the forest for the trees. Talk to us a little bit about Cain as a metaphor for modern man rejecting God. I've never heard anybody try to apply that angle to Cain as a character.
Well, it's really interesting because in the other with the other murders in the book, I go to works of art like Alfred Hitchcock's movie Psycho and Silence of the Lambs and Crime and Punishment and all those things. But because this is the first murder, and it's actually the first event in the Bible that happens after the fall of man, it actually sets the pattern of history. In life, when you have traumas, you kind of relive those traumas over and over again, and it's as if mankind relives the trauma of Cain and Abel throughout history. And I look at the way the theme recurs in the Bible, the theme of brother battle recurs again and again in the Bible. Almost every story in the Old Testament involves some kind of clash between brothers. And in each case, it reveals a different part of the theme of this first murder. And and one of the themes that comes up, and actually Byron wrote a poem about this, a long poem about it, is the theme that Cain doesn't offer a sacrifice that is acceptable to God. And in many of the glosses that people have written about this, they pointed out that it's not just the fact that his sacrifice isn't as beautiful or isn't as fatty or isn't as it's the spirit in which it is offered. And Cain is presented in many writings as a character who is basically saying, we kind of got cheated here. We didn't sin, our parents sinned, and yet we're the ones who were thrown out of the garden. Why are we thrown out of the garden? Why did God put temptation in the way of Adam and Eve? Why am I like? Why is your sacrifice okay and my sacrifice isn't okay? Why does God, who has not treated us justly, have the right to judge us? Judge us, and that goes through a lot of the Jewish writings about Cain and Abel, and it goes into some of the themes that come up in the Bible about Cain and Abel. And so I think it's really interesting to watch the themes of envy, of human sacrifice, which is a huge theme in the Old Testament, and the theme of rejecting God as just. This is one of the biggest problems people have who don't believe in God. The first thing out of their mouth is almost always, how can you believe in God in a world of so much evil? How can you believe that God is good in a world of so much evil? And I think that is one of the things that works itself out in the story of Cain and Abel. And one of my arguments in the book, as the book goes on, is that the making of ugliness beautiful is a hint of what God is doing. You think like, well, how can we have a good world when so much evil takes place? But if we have faith, we kind of realize, oh, wait, there's a bigger design that is beautiful, and that's the response to the ugliness that we have created in our sin and that the world creates through its accidental brokenness. And I think that is built into Cain and Abel, that Cain and Abel actually leads. And I kind of trace this thought in the book. Cain and Abel leads to Christ. And Christ, is you see him, as kind of balanced with Adam. And that's the brother battle at the sort of extremes of history. Adam as the sort of first brother, and Jesus as the second Adam who comes back.
I think today culturally we're very confused about how to relate to good and evil. Like so much that is good has been called evil, so much that is evil has been called good. Just as folks in this modern context, do we struggle to relate to dark literature? Or are we relating differently than say people were 10, 15, 25, 30 years ago? I'm curious to hear from your perspective, that cultural shift, how has it affected what we glean from these sorts of stories?
One of the most disturbing things to me about talking to young men, especially about art, is that so many of them love horror movies. And I always ask them, because this has happened again and again to me, talking to younger men. I always ask them, why do I? Because I've seen a lot of horror movies, and I'll say this was really an ugly movie. I don't really like horror movies. I like scary movies, but I don't like horror movies. And I'll say, well, this was just so ugly, and the images are so ugly. Why did you like this? And they always say the same thing. It made me feel something. And I think that with the loss of faith in our society, which is far worse, I think, than people think it is, in the sense that it actually affects people who have faith. It actually blurs the vision of people who have faith. With the loss of faith in our society, I think we've lost the ability to make art that resonates with deep truth. So if you're going to I don't want to pick on anybody, but if you're going to say God is not dead, number five, you're not really being touched by deep truth. You're having a soft, gentle, reassuring experience, and that's great, but you're not being absolutely ravished by deep truth the way great art will ravish you. And so you've got these young men who are looking for experience, who are looking for depth, who are looking for the real stuff of life. And you're showing them this happy, I lost my bunny, but Jesus gave it back to me kind of stuff, and I think that feeling, that depth of feeling has gone out of the arts because God has gone out of the arts. And when I think of Crime and Punishment, when I think of Shakespeare's Macbeth, when I think of the paintings in the Sistine Chapel, so full of anguish and horror, the Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel is so full of horror and anguish. That's not available to young men in religious art, in art that ultimately is saying, no, wait, this is part of the picture, but there's a picture beyond this. And I think that is really troubling to me. I think in the old days, you went to horror movies knowing who to root for. I tell this story all the time because it actually happened to me. I was working in Hollywood. I like ghost stories, and ghost stories tend to be nonviolent, but they tend to be scary. And I would write these ghost stories, and I sold a lot of ghost stories, and so people started to ask me, studios started to ask me to come in and listen to their story that they wanted me to write. This is something that happens in Hollywood. And one day, one of them called me in and said, "We have a story. We want to know how you would write the story." And I said, "Okay, great." And they said, a woman is kidnapped and she's tortured. And I said, "Yeah." And they said, "That's it. That's the story." And I said, "Yeah, I can't write this." I said, when a woman is running away from a murderer on screen, I'm rooting for the woman. And that was all I had to say to get myself kicked out of the room. I was like, don't let the door hit you on the way out. I think that modern horror movies frequently relish the horror, relish the pain. They have a thing they actually call torture porn, which is not necessarily porn, but it has the same pattern again and again, where a woman is shown in a highly sexualized position early in the movie, nude and, having sex or whatever, and then increasingly butchered as the film goes on and tortured in creative and ugly ways. And that to me is actual evil art. That's not at all what I'm talking about in the Kingdom of Cain, although I mention it to condemn it. What I'm talking about is people who say, here is something that happens in real life. What does it mean? How can I show it to you in a way that illuminates it? And so I think that there is a real ugliness, especially in Hollywood films, that horror has taken on that it didn't always have. I mean, you can go back and look at horror, and it's scary and it's spooky, and sometimes it's fun. It's not, there's nothing wrong with being scared in a movie, but it wasn't. It didn't have that lost sense of that. Now we're on the bad guy's side, and the bad guy is what we're here for.
Well, in terms of, stories, whether we're talking, books, movies, I mean, I think one of the beautiful things is it can sometimes bypass people's defenses and get good messages into people when they're
Yeah.
not expecting it. But again, and I know we all, many of us pick on God's Not Dead. I know they've had great intentions through the years with that, but maybe come up with a new plot. That story is getting kind of dated. But in terms of like, going back to like sanitizing, ignoring sin in our storytelling, or even like glossing over those things in the Bible, kind of with that idea of that it can bypass some of our defenses in terms of really touching people through a gripping novel or a film that have these dark themes of murder, betrayal, evil, like like losing that opportunity to touch the soul in those circumstances because we're trying to be too clean, we're sanitizing things too much, like maybe from the lens of with your own writing and how people responded to your work, like how has the darkness you've had in some of your novels been able to touch people, get to the soul in a way that if it had been this clean story, it just wouldn't have had that same impact?
Well, I think of a scene in my novel Empire of Lies, which is about a guy who has a very ugly, kind of twisted sex life and then finds Christ and he stops. He leaves it, he marries, he's happy. And then he's drawn back into his old life by something that he has to do, a good deed that he has to perform. And he's drawn back into this world. And there's a scene where he gets drunk and he's sitting in front of the TV and he starts watching porn. And he starts to say, why can't life be like this? Why can't sex be this easy? It's just a thing that people do with their bodies. It's just objects coming together that make you feel good. Why does it have to be so complicated? And now when I show that, especially to Christian people in the publishing industry. They're like, they gasped, how could you write such a scene? When I show it to men, they say, oh yeah, I think that I wonder that all the time. I question that all the time. So now they're on my side because now they're saying, yes, you showed me myself as I really am, as I never wanted anybody to see me, as I thought I was fooling people. I thought I was fooling people, that people didn't know I was like this, but you caught me out. Where are you taking me with this? And I think that that is a very powerful thing that we completely lose when we don't tell the truth. When we tell people that, every girl is a virgin, every man is ultimately trying to do the right thing. Listen, I like good guys in stories, but I also want to hear stories about bad guys. I want to hear stories about everything. I want to hear stories about every aspect of human life, because if God is not present in every aspect of human life, I don't know where he is. I mean, it's like I don't think he's sitting anything out. I think that he is not God of fairyland. He's God of this planet, and this planet is very dark.
Let's go next into kind of an application question. I think of all the pub boards I've been in, and there's a particular guy on one of my teams right now who says, "How does this message apply for the single mom in the trailer park? How is this going to change her life?" Like for someone, whether they're going through a dark season, facing loss, deep uncertainty, whatever they might have in their life. Is there a spiritual, like, is there a way that the walking through this book could be a companion on somebody's spiritual journey to work through darkness?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that was the inspiration for the book. I mean, I was looking. I think every Christian. I think this happens to every thinking Christian. You now have made yourself aware that there is a moral order. That it's not made up. It's not a fiction. It's not something we're all just pretending is there. It is a real thing that we are experiencing as human beings. And I know a lot of guys and girls who have reached that point. A lot of Christian people who have reached that revelation, and they go dark. They start to talk about, well, it's the end of days. There's no use going to work. There's no use saving money. It's the end of days. It's the end. And I think, like, I don't know, this time is compared to other times is no worse than other times. It's just that you're living in it. That's the only difference. Then there are people who become so pessimistic that there's no way back. Everything is unraveling. Our culture is falling apart. And look, maybe that's true. Cultures ultimately all fall apart. And so maybe this is that time, but maybe it's not too. And maybe to live in hope is actually one of our responsibilities. And so I think that to understand that it's not just you seeing this, and it's everybody. We're all living in this world, and we all kind of wake up in the morning and think, like, what is going on? How do people? I mean, I'm sure you've had this experience where you read a newspaper and you think, like, what are people doing in this world? And I think that to say, yes, this is the world where you're supposed to be happy, not God is not dead world, this world. I think is I think that's very strengthening. I think that puts some backbone into you and teaches you that this is where you're supposed to rejoice. This is the world that you're supposed to rejoice in. I mean, and so you can do that. You can pretend to rejoice by ignoring the things that you see, but I think that that's very flimsy. I think that deep joy that you feel in being alive, even in this corrupted, fallen world, I think that that's the stuff of faith. And I think that that's what this book is about. That's what it hopefully is helping people see and hoping people move toward.
In terms of maybe encountering like hidden parts of God in the midst of suffering or darkness, like I went through a journey of losing my spouse to cancer about a year ago, and
Oh,
I
sorry.
discovered aspects of God that I've never seen in any part of my life journey. I've emerged a very different person on the other side of that. But in terms of like, I feel like suffering, darkness, walking through that valley, if you will, unlocks aspects of God you can only see in the midst of that. Comment a little bit about that. Like, can we see aspects of God in terms of dark literature and sometimes evil portrayed in literature that we can't see maybe in lighter circumstances?
I think absolutely. I mean, I always tell people, because people write to me a lot and they ask me questions, and a lot of people write me in moments of grief. And I've been through moments of grief. Obviously, you've been through moments of grief. And I always say grief is a desert that has to be crossed on foot. And what I mean by that is that it doesn't go away when you want it to go away. It doesn't go away when your friends tell you to get over it. It goes away when you've made that journey. It's very different to make that journey, as I can tell you, and I'm sure a lot of people know, it's very different to make that journey following God, even if you feel alone and incredibly frustrated and incredibly hurt, to make that journey following God like the North Star than it is to make that journey wandering around and not knowing where you're going to come out. And I think that one of the things about art that I think people get wrong is art is not a sugar pill with a message inside. That's not what art is. Art is an experience. It's the same thing as standing on a mountaintop, climbing a mountain, getting hit by a car. All of those things are experiences that you have that change you. Those things change you. Art is like that, except that it's safe, right? Nobody really dies in art. Nobody is, I mean, nothing is really bad is happening, but it takes you to those places. We've all wept when a character we love dies. We've all been frightened when a character we love is walking on the ledge or being chased, through a dark room. It takes you into those places that you are one day going to go. Things are going to happen that make you afraid, that make you grieve, that make you sorrowful. And art takes you to that place. And if it's great art, it shows you something about it that actually is redeeming. I think that even without messaging, even without saying, oh, and in the end, everything is Jesus, which I think is, not that effective, but even just showing it to you with deep truth, it actually is redeeming because this also is a world of redemption. This is a world where redemption is on offer. That is not a fantasy, that is a reality. And so artists who tell the truth can tell the darkest tragedies. I was mentioning Macbeth before. It's just a dark, dark tragedy. And when you come out of it, yet you feel stronger in some way. You feel richer, and you feel the play was beautiful, and you want to keep that play inside you somehow. And I think that that is what the arts are really about. It's not just a little, lesson that we're teaching you here. Even though art has themes and you can talk about the themes and all that stuff, it's not that. It's an experience. And I think that that's one of the things that if I can communicate that to people and teach them to relate to art differently, they'll stop being so afraid of it. Because I think that a religion without art is going to die. It's going to die. It's art. I mean, like I said, Christianity at its height, at its most pervasive, at its most believed, was the religion of the greatest art ever made.
Yeah, I think that's one of the tragedies of the modern worship area in the average church. It's just white walls. There's no stained glass, no art.
Yeah.
Very sanitized from what many of us grew up with and saw in younger days. In terms of, say, like I could see this book being very helpful for like a Christian who is creative, whether they're an author or an artist, just maybe challenging them to get into some other themes. Like for the creative who encounters this book, like what do you hope's the takeaway, or maybe how going through the Kingdom of Cain impacts their art in a good way down the road?
I think that's a really good question because I think one of the things they're all going to face is what I face is those letters that say you call yourself a Christian, and it wraps them up. And the terrible thing about this is a lot of people writing those letters are watching Game of Thrones because Game of Thrones is incredibly entertaining and a really good piece. So they're watching that, and that's okay. It's okay to watch the nudity and the killing and all that because that's not Christian. So it's like, in other words, they're telling the Christian that only he cannot make good art. He alone has to not make good art. And I hope that this is liberating for creatives. I hope it's saying, look, this is the kind of art I make. I don't sugarcoat it. Not all my stories end with a happy ending. Not all my stories end with God coming down in a cloud. None of my stories end with God coming down in a cloud because I've never seen God come down in a cloud. And so I write what I see. I write the world I know. And I think that should be liberating. And it should be liberating not just to the artist, but to the audience as well.
And Andrew, for the listeners who want to pick up a copy of The Kingdom of Cain or connect with you, find out about your many other great books, where can we connect with you? Where can we buy the book?
Well, it's available on Amazon. It's available now. I think it's going to be published in about 5 days, but people are already receiving it. On Amazon, it's always good for me because it moves it up if you buy it there, it moves it up the ranking, which is helpful. And, come and listen to me on the Daily Wire. And if you go to andrewklavan.com, that's my website. You can contact me there and it'll take you to all the other books I've written and all the other stuff I do.
Well, Andrew, thank you so much for joining us today and for writing a book that dares to look into the shadows in order to help people find the light. It's been a pleasure.
It's great seeing you again, Shaun. Thanks.